The Marines have landed. The United States' trademark foreign expedition force deployed to Los Angeles. This on top of the U.S. president enrolling the National Guard in a show of force against pockets of violent protest against the arrest of undocumented immigrants at their place of work in Southern California. It's a fight that Donald Trump clearly wanted to pick for a long time, going over the head of the Democratic governor of that state just days before another first. In Washington, a U.S. president staging a military parade on his own birthday. In his first term, Trump's Republican Party was the party of states' rights, regularly accusing the federal government of overreach. How did it all change so fast? A nation with a determined far right that's up against a splintered mainstream? Well, that sounds a lot like France, where the next presidential election is in 2 years, as Marine Le Pen's party harks back to its trademark anti-immigrant rhetoric, a topic where a majority of U.S. citizens, by the way, back Trump. What lessons from the seemingly fast-changing form of democracy in America? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Trump's militarized response to those L.A. anti-deportation protests. We're joined by our Los Angeles correspondent, Wasim Cornet. He'll be giving us an update in a moment after a short night. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, Francois. Good to be with you.
From Washington, Robert Weissman, co-president of Public Citizens. I believe you're one of the groups behind next Saturday's No Kings rallies across the U.S. Tell us what that's about.
Here we are. It's great to be with you. Americans across the country are going to be turning out next week, except not in Washington, D.C., under the banner of No Kings to protest the authoritarian nature of the Trump regime. We're going to stay away from D.C. and Trump's military parade.
All right, with us, and we have a surfeit of Weissmans, although it's not spelled exactly the same way. He's a former federal prosecutor and FBI general counsel. Andrew Weissman, professor at NYU Law School. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Columnist, communication strategist, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, senior partner at political consultants Iconic. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Francois.
And thanks to Hind Zian, founder and CEO of consultants, I pronounce it the French way, Génération Politique.
As you wish. Thank you so much for having me.
Reminder, you can always listen, that's right, listen to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. Their mission, strictly to defend federal property and personnel. Some 700 active duty Marines called in on top of the National Guard reinforcements to Los Angeles. Emily Boyle has more.
2,000 additional National Guard troops and 700 US Marines, a clear escalation and the latest deployments of the Trump administration after a weekend of protests in downtown LA. US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced the move on social media. He claimed they would be sent to restore order and protect federal law enforcement. The deployment is unprecedented. Marines have not been mobilized within the US since the 1992 riots in Los Angeles. The announcement means that the 700 Marines would join a total of 4,000 National Guards. Local officials have called the move authoritarian and unnecessary.
We didn't need the National Guard. Why on earth? What are they going to do? Do you know what the National Guard is doing now? They are guarding two buildings. They're guarding the federal building here in downtown, and they're guarding the federal building in Westwood. That's what they're doing. So they need Marines on top of it? I don't understand that. That's why I feel like we are part of an experiment that we did not ask to be a part of.
No National Guard!
It is still unclear what exactly the US Marines will be authorized to do once on the ground. Like National Guard troops, they are prohibited from conducting law enforcement activity like making arrests. This is, of course, unless Trump invokes the Insurrection Act.
I wouldn't call it quite an insurrection, but it could have led to an insurrection. I mean, that was a lot of harm that was going on last night. I watched it very closely, and it was amazing that the job that the National Guard did. And by the way, the police were working very hard also.
On Monday evening, smaller clashes between protesters and law enforcement were reported close to an ICE detention center in downtown LA. Police dispersed crowds by using weapons like rubber bullets and tear gas. Governor Gavin Newsom announced on Monday that California is suing the Trump administration, accusing the president of unlawfully bypassing the governor's authority and sending in the National Guard into the city of Los Angeles.
And we'll be asking about that lawsuit, but first let's cross, as promised, to Wasim Cornet in Los Angeles. Wasim, earlier in the day at the White House, the U.S. president speaking, talking about a Los Angeles under siege before he called in the National Guard and the Marines, and saying that the city would have been burning. Tell us, from what you experienced firsthand, how big are these protests?
I mean, let me just say right off the bat that a city under siege is just a little bit of an overstatement. You know, this is Santa Monica Boulevard, one of the main thoroughfares through Los Angeles. This is regular traffic on a Tuesday morning. The city seems to be operating completely normally. My usual coffee shop is open. There are no traffic restrictions except for the immediate, really heart of downtown. And really, those are just mainly for cleanup operations. Cleanup crews from the city have been working very hard since this morning to clear up graffiti, to clear up any damage left. There were a few burned vehicles and also a few stores that were unfortunately ransacked and looted late last Monday night. But for the most part, this is a city that is operating normally. And you heard it in that soundbite, in that story that we just watched. The disbelief from the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, saying, "What are these troops doing? What are these National Guards doing? They're guarding two federal buildings, the downtown federal building and another building in the neighborhood of Westwood." So that really translates sort of the atmosphere here as to why exactly are all these people here. If you count the 2,000 initial mobilized National Guard troops and the additional deployment of 2,000 other National Guard troops and then the 700 Marines, that's more than triple the number of protesters that were in downtown yesterday. So a bit of an overreaction here, at least when it comes to the situation on the ground here in LA, because the protests yesterday were really confined to, at most, a 10-block radius around the historic downtown, historic Little Tokyo area.
Donald Trump asked how long the Marines would stay, saying until there is no danger, and that all I want is safety. Wasim Cornet, just very briefly, is there a sense that the presence of these federal troops is contributing to keeping the peace or to stoking tension?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, if these troops are fully deployed, because as of this morning, that was not yet fully the case. Just yesterday, for example, authorities were saying that of the initial deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops, they were only seeing 300 on the ground. If these troops are all fully mobilized and these protests end, then Donald Trump can use that as a soundbite saying that essentially he restored law and order into the city. And we saw that on his social media this morning, saying that if he hadn't intervened, the city would have been burned to the ground. However, if local population react angrily to the deployment, which is really the predominant feeling and emotion here in LA, then the president will likely use that as saying this was very much needed and I will send in additional reinforcements. So there's really no way to win against this attempt of a huge show of force from the federal government.
Wasim Cornet, so many thanks for that live update from Los Angeles, keeping us posted on what's now the fifth day of all of this. Robert Weissman, why did Donald Trump deploy federal forces?
He deployed federal forces because he's been intending to do it since he took office again. It's part of his plan to expand his authoritarian reach. It's doing an injustice to the word pretext to say this is pretextual. There was nothing going on in Los Angeles. The little bit of scuffling that has occurred is entirely initiated by the Immigration Enforcement Agency and now with this additional deployment by Trump. The only purpose of this is to lay the groundwork for increased militarization of our society and increased deployment of military, not just against immigrant communities, as serious as that is, but as against protesters against his authoritarian regime. That was the intent the moment he took office, and now he sees an imaginary opportunity to start the process. There is something we can do about it, which is to not accept it and protest. And I think that's what we're going to see increasingly, especially across the nation here in the United States this weekend.
Increased militarization. Andrew Weissman, we heard the U.S. president again in those remarks that a little while ago, harking back to regrets, a grievance that he had over the way the Black Lives Matters protests of 2020 were handled in Minneapolis. Is it a grievance or is it a plan to militarize the United States?
Well, I do think that there is a real interest in having more military on the ground, because he has been saying that since the first term. He's been saying it since he was out of office. And so I think I totally agree that that's what we're seeing now. I think that's why you're hearing language about a rebellion and the sort of overhyping of what's going on, because the statute at issue here requires, for it to be lawful, requires that there is an invasion or a rebellion or a complete failure of law enforcement to be able to carry out its functions.
He's yet to invoke this law from 1807.
Well, that's the Insurrection Act. That's true, but he invoked a law that requires there to be a rebellion or invasion or a complete failure of law enforcement. That is not what is happening. That's why it was so good for you to have somebody who's there in Los Angeles, because nobody in the right mind would say, oh, look, where there's a rebellion going on against the government. And I do think it's important to compare this to what this administration said about January 6th. January 6th, in their view, where there was an actual insurrection attempt going on, was viewed by them as a glorious day and not an insurrection. So I think contrasting the failure to bring any sort of law enforcement on that day to what I think and agree is pretextual as in terms of what is going on now. And I think there's a reason that Gavin Newsom has brought this lawsuit is because it does not comply with the law.
But again, to rebound on what Robert Weissman says, is this a grievance, or is this a plan to militarize the United States?
Well, I don't know that it has to be an either or. I mean, I think you could have it be both.
Hinzian?
It's a big question. I think it's hard to objectively say. Going back to what you were saying, Andrew, so what Donald Trump said basically was under the Title 10 of the U.S. Code, section inside the Title 10, if there is in a specific state an invasion, the risk of an insurrection, or the incapacity for the federal government to enforce public order and to enforce American law, then there should be what is called sending of the National Guard. So in America, technically, there's this 1878 act that says you can't send in troops to have missions of law enforcement, local civil law enforcement. Now, the U.S. Code, the Title 10 section in Title 10 doesn't actually go back on that. It just says that those troops, National Guard troops, can be sent, and those troops are going to be protecting federal offices and federal officials.
So what you're saying is, Hind, there are laws that are so far back, hundreds of years old, that you can point to whichever law you prefer.
Insurrection laws in America are a little bit hard to interpret because they were laws that were made at the beginning of the Union, and the goal of those laws, the Insurrection Act, which is a little bit older in 1807, was to protect the country from factions and militias that are trying to take power, from actual rebellions. So those laws are a little bit dangerous today, specifically because it is so hard to interpret them. And what the Trump team and Trump administration is saying is, well, there wasn't an insurrection, but we were going towards an insurrection. And so that law gives me the right to actually send national guards. So everything lies in the interpretation. Then we're going to see what the courts are going to be saying, maybe even the Supreme Court is going to be saying. But these are, by essence, laws that are difficult to interpret, and that could lead to people actually saying, well, because we believe that there is a risk of insurrection or there's an actual insurrection, we're going to send in more troops, and there's not going to be necessarily an end to that. However, for now, he hasn't actually invoked the Insurrection Act, but it was invoked in the past, and it could be something, if it keeps going, that could be invoked.
All right, and language does matter. So let's take a look at the language. The LA protesters have been waving Mexican flags out of pride for their community, they say. But it is enough for the vice president, J.D. Vance, to hint at a foreign invasion. his short version of what's been happening. Insurrectionists carrying foreign flags are attacking immigration enforcement officers, while one half of America's political leadership has decided that border enforcement is evil. This while the defense secretary actually employs the term invasion. Pete Hegseth, in a tweet where he makes the unsubstantiated claim that there is a dangerous invasion facilitated by criminal cartels, posing, Philippe, a huge national security risk. Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, this painting of a foreign invasion.
You know, there was a movie called Invasion Los Angeles. It says it's a B-rated movie. It's not a very good movie, but still, it's part of the popular culture. And what we are seeing is a TV show produced by Donald J. Trump. And everything he does is being a TV anchor, a TV guy, a TV host, producing a TV show for the MAGA crowd. This MAGA crowd is encircled and contained into a cognitive bubble, and they will believe the fiction that he wants them to believe. And they believe, I think, even in Paris, I have some MAGA friends in Paris. There are MAGAs in Paris too, François. They don't know what to believe. Because what they read is that there is a huge problem in Los Angeles. The city is under siege, under fire. You've got Mexicans raising flags and destroying cars, which happened maybe once or twice, and it happened a lot in French riots, everywhere around the globe. There are things like that, and it's not significant, because it's not. Nothing really happened in Los Angeles, as we saw with your correspondent. And on the other hand, this reality,
so hold on.
They have trouble believing it.
Again, I go back to what Robert Weissman said at the beginning of our conversation, which is this militarization of democracy. You're saying, no, it's Donald Trump who wants to keep us entertained, and that's how
he's in trouble. He wanted to do that from the beginning, that's for sure, because he targeted California from the beginning. He threatened California. He threatened California to suspend the federal aids, to which the governor replied, okay, if you don't give us money anymore, you know what, we have a surplus. We give you 19 billion surplus for your federal budget. If you don't give us any aids, if you suspend all the payments, we won't give you any money. So we are that close to a civil war. That's the reality of it. There is no real...
A civil war?
The city is not under siege, but there is a governor threatening the president and the president threatening the governor to cut budget ties. That's the reality of the situation. And it's always like that with Trump. He's starting from nothing and creating a huge, big problem in the end. And that's where we are heading at. But there is nothing in Los Angeles. Nothing is happening in Los Angeles, except that we have a Democratic governor. And you know, in the press, what we read is that Trump's aides are congratulating themselves because they're saying, we are forcing the Democrats again in supporting the 20%, you know, of the population that is anti our immigration stance. We are on the side of the 80% that support our immigration laws. So everything is good for us. They are playing politics, François. It's only a political thing. There is nothing real except the fact that Trump wants to control the political situation in the States. So with the army.
Robert Weissman, are we reading too much into it? You heard Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, a personal grievance against this Democratic governor of California. And it's good for ratings, as he said after that blow-up with Volodymyr Zelensky, or, as you're suggesting, a cognitive plan to alter the shape of what is U.S. democracy.
Yeah, well, I think what's pretend is that there's some actual issue going on in Los Angeles where there's very small protests, very little conflict, and what conflict there is being initiated by law enforcement. I think that's what we're saying is there's no there there. There's no remotely plausible justification for bringing in military or National Guard, leaving aside what the law says, just as a matter of common sense. There's no possible reason to do it. I think everybody agrees on that. What I'm suggesting, though, is they, in fact, are deploying thousands of National Guard and hundreds of Marines, and that is serious. It's not part of the American political tradition. And it is part of an intentional plan by Donald Trump and his allies to start doing this on a much more widespread basis. Their legal order authorizing the deployment in Los Angeles is actually not geographically limited to Los Angeles or time limited in any way. It's an open-ended order suggesting they can do this anywhere in the country where there's either violence or even the perceived threat of violence. And we know they intended this as part of their authoritarian move coming in, and now they're beginning to carry out that plan. It's on us to respond and not let it go forward.
And Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet saying that there is this jousting over money between the state of California and the federal government. So how far could this go, Robert?
Well, there is a multi-chapter authoritarian playbook that they're deploying. And early on, the withholding of grants to states across the country, and particularly to California, was one exercise of that authoritarian power. This issue is going to be litigated between the governor and the Trump administration, and it'll tease out however it does. It is the case that the president has a lot of authority in this area and a lot of potential to abuse that authority. I think that's what we're going to see. I don't think California is on the verge of seceding from the country, but I do think that this is a grave moment for the nation because this is not a one-off. It has nothing to do with what's going on in Los Angeles and everything to do with the president's desire to militarize the country, deepen his authoritarian control, and intimidate and threaten not just immigrants, but anyone who's protesting and standing up to his policies.
Andrew Weissman, a lawsuit filed by the governor of California evoking the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which talks about the rights of states to manage their own affairs, something in the past Republicans evoked a lot. But legally speaking, again, it comes back to the gray areas that Hind was talking about earlier. How strong is the governor's case against the Trump administration? He can deploy federal troops.
Well, it depends. It depends what the justification is, what the law that is being used, and it depends what they're doing there. The law that was invoked here, as I noted, requires there to be either a rebellion that was found, an invasion that was found, or that all law enforcement essentially can't do their work. It also requires that the order go through the governor of the state. None of those things, in my view, are true here. I mean, I think, in other words, that I think the governor has a really good argument. He also has a really good argument that goes to exactly what was just pointed out, which is that the order that was issued by the president is not targeted to California. It is a nationwide order, meaning that there's no finding of a sort of global invasion of the United States or a rebellion against the United States, or that law enforcement can't do its work in the United States. But this order, just to be clear, is not about just being able to send troops into California. It is saying they're allowed to do it anywhere in the United States. And I think that is a real weakness for the administration in defending what the president did.
All right, and we heard the U.S. president speaking last Sunday, and he was asked about more domestic deployments like the one in California.
We're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country. We're not going to let our country be torn apart like it was under Biden and his auto pen.
What's the bar for sending Marines?
The bar is what I think it is. I mean, if we see danger to our country and to our citizens, we'll be very, very strong in terms of law and order.
The bar is what I think it is. Hind Zian, what's going on in the United States?
I'm just going to try to take a different perspective and maybe to play a different tune. We have to see this in a certain context. You have a president who, while he was running for the presidency, while he was campaigning, said, when I get to office, I'm going to make sure that all people that are troublemakers, we're going to send troops to make sure that they respect this country and that they respect its laws. So if you really look at Trump as a person, as a president, and also sort of this guy who's been able to make a comeback based on his base, the people who've been voting for him for years, but also new people who are unhappy with things, with the system, with how things are working, you have sort of the recipe of somebody who would say someday, yes, we're going to send troops because it isn't unacceptable for us to see people who are making any type of destruction on cars or buildings or not letting IC workers, immigration officers, execute the order that was given by the White House. So you have a specific context that have brought to this. It doesn't come out of nowhere. That's what I'm trying to say. And what's interesting is in the order, they said something like, acts of violence inhibit the execution of the laws, therefore they are an act of rebellion. So their definition of what an act of rebellion is a very broad one.
And so do they get to make that? Do they get to make that definition?
We're gonna have to see what the judges say. But I just have to remind everybody that there are a lot of lawsuits currently waiting for trial or waiting for a judge to make a decision against this administration. And it's always been hard. Like when he's the president and he's issuing executive orders, what type of counterpowers do you have? And it's not always that easy because it ends up always going to what? The Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court can always say, we actually can't say much about this because this is how the law was made and the law is not particularly clear. So I think in advance it's hard to say.
Let me turn again to the former federal prosecutor here, Andrew Weissman. There's a difference between unprecedented, which is what this is, and illegal. And when Donald Trump says the bar for sending Marines is what I think it is it illegal?
So just to be clear, that is not what the law says. The actual statute that he invoked does not say it is whatever the president says. There are specific things that Congress said have to be found. This issue about sort of an invasion and rebellion, there is a good analogy here. This is exactly what the president tried to say when he did summary extractions of immigrants and sent them to El Salvador. So far, 4 federal courts have said that was illegal, that there was no invasion by this Venezuelan gang. It does not meet the definition. And that is a thing for the courts to decide. That is the courts saying, we will interpret the congressional law and there are limits on executive power. So I know the president wants to say, I've got full power to do whatever I want. And the courts in the United States have pushed back on that. And I point out, the Supreme Court of the United States has found that this president violated due process 9-0. When is the last time that you've seen the Supreme Court of the United States decide anything 9-0, given how sort of fractured it is politically? And that gives you a sense of sort of how off the charts what it is that the president is trying to do here.
And while things go through the courts at a deliberate pace sometimes, the administration using a lot of muscle, Marines deployed to Los Angeles. We've been talking about it. Tanks will be rolled out in Washington on Saturday, are already being rolled out there. You see those Abrams tanks on Monday in preparations for the big parade to mark the 250th anniversary of the U.S. military. This is also, by the way, just a coincidence, says the president, that it's also on his birthday. And this is where you'll be organizing, as you told us at the outset, Robert Weissman, not in Washington, but in plenty of other cities, No King's Day rallies. Here's a question for you, though. Earlier, in describing what was going on in Los Angeles, Donald Trump talking of some bad people, quote, paid troublemakers, insurrectionists. If there is violence on Saturday, how do you handle it?
Well, we're committed to nonviolent protest everywhere across the country. We now have more than 1,800 planned across the nation. We are training our leaders in nonviolence and de-escalation tactics. It's going to be a family-friendly event. There's not going to be any violence. If I could say one thing, though, about this issue of troublemakers, it's a little bit off point, but it does throw things into relief. The president says he's got zero tolerance for anyone who violates the law and so on. He's tough on crime and so on. It just so happens that today or yesterday, his Justice Department has announced a policy that it will no longer enforce the criminal bribery statutes for overseas bribery by U.S. corporations. And that follows a project by this administration to dismiss case after case after case after corporate criminal wrongdoers. So the idea that he is tough on crime that he's trying to put forward is a complete fiction. He's tough on vulnerable people. But when it comes to the powerful who have the ability to both follow the law and inflict major harm on regular people when they don't, he's a patsy. All they have to do is make a contribution or buy some Bitcoin, and he's going to let them off. So I just think we should be really clear that this is nothing to do with some objective effort to be tough on law enforcement. He is an authoritarian. He's out of the authoritarian playbook. All this deployment of the military is part of a plan, just as his selective use of law enforcement, including the selective non-enforcement against corporations and billionaires, is also part of his authoritarian plan.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
Yeah, we see an accelerated version, a TikTok version of the authoritarian Putin playbook.
The Putin playbook?
Yeah, the inside, the invasion from the inside, the people attacking the institutions. Putin did pretty much the same, but at the time at least, there were real troubles going on with Chechnya, for instance, but that's not the case. That's a complete pure fiction. But he has an inside thing going on with people, bad people that he wants to go against, and then there is the military parade, and that's uncanny at best. I mean, it's really from the outside what we see is an accelerated version of Putin taking power, taking charge.
We have a military parade on Bastille Day. It's a national holiday.
I'm sorry to say, that's not programmed on the very birthday of our president. That's always July the 14th in France. And maybe we will have a president one day born on July the 14th, but it will indeed be an accident. That's not been happening for them. And what we see is that he's a dystopian president. He wants to govern inside of a fiction. And the problem that he has, the main problem is that he has lawyers in front of him, and he has trials. He has a lot of, things that are, not good for his fiction, for the fairy tale he's telling to his MAGA crowds. And these friction points, I don't know how long they will last. That's the real thing. How long will we have trials, judges, people that are able to go against his will? And what happens if there are 100 condemnations of what he did and nothing happens? And that's so sad to see. The US are the beacon of democracy for countries like ours, and that's really uncanny and sad to see that.
In Xi'an, who outlasts who? The judiciary or the executive branch of government in this?
I mean, it's going to be hard for me to make a bet, but I just think that, we're probably going to see a president who's going to push as much as he can to enforce his vision of government, of politics. And it's larger than just somebody who was elected once and who's just doing business as usual. He vowed to bring about cultural change. So it's going to be interesting to see how much judges are going to be able to resist to that. But my take on it is that he's been elected for 4 years, maybe more. I don't know. I hope not. But he's been elected at least for 4 years. And we're going to have, with time, to see how judges are adapting to his way of ruling. Are they going to say, because you have some judges who are saying that, but you have people also around him who are making the case, well, he's the president. There's a way for presidents to govern this country. It is usually through executive orders. So he has the right to enforce those executive orders because he is the representation of the people. So it's, I think, beyond if it's good or bad or if it's moral or not. Is this a new definition of democracy in America, which is like, I have those people behind me who are supporting me, who are supporting what I do. You have a serious poll that actually says more than half of Americans, 54% of Americans, support his policy of deportations. Like, we can think that it's terrible. absolutely think that it's wrong, but then you have people who support it, and it's more than
Has
half of the
democracy in
population.
America changed forever, Andrew Weissman?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle. And I think the answer to the question of who outlasts who in terms of the courts versus the executive branch is it's worth noting that while we're all talking about this, there are scores of people in prison in El Salvador. And the Supreme Court of the United States has said unanimously twice that they are there in violation of the Constitution, that their due process rights were violated. They're still there. So one of the things that Donald Trump has learned is courts are slow. They do not have an army to enforce their rules. And there is a standoff right now going on in the United States where you have court order after court order, and you don't see the administration complying with it.
And the question is there a playbook for Europe? While Trump was sending in the Marines, France's presidential frontrunner, our elections in 2027, was on Monday welcoming 6,000 like-minded souls to the Loire Valley village of Mormant-sur-Vernisson. The far-right's Marine Le Pen, who in 3 runs for president has gone to great lengths to make her movement seem more mainstream, harking back in her speech to bashing Brussels and to bashing foreigners who've come to replace French civilization.
This Macron-Merkel migration pact, the one that Interior Minister Bruno Retailleau boasts of enforcing, it's a pact with the devil, a pact of being submerged in migration in Europe, a pact of demographic dilution, a pact of cultural extinction of Europe. With us, an anarchic immigration without limits. It's a no, no, no.
Non, non et non.
Philippe Chevrolet, French political pundits were surprised a little bit to see Marine Le Pen hark back to a message that was more associated with her late father, talking about the great replacement. Before, she was mostly dog whistle messages of late. Is there a Trump effect in Marine Le Pen's strategy looking ahead to 2027?
I think so, yes. There is a globalized far right that actually the US are leading. And there is a huge influence in terms of, money, political support, media power, even media literacy. The far right has benefited from your experience in the US. All the knowledge of the social networks that have been gathered during the campaigns on the Republican side have been shared with people around the globe, and especially in France. The far right is much more advanced in that department. And, networks such as X or TikTok the algorithms are pushing the content of the far right. So she is into that predicament. She is between what she really would want to achieve, which would be to be a kind of a normal president, much more on the right than the others, but not that much. A kind of a president that could be like a far-right version of Jacques Chirac, for instance. She wanted to do that for a while, but then she was condemned and she couldn't be a candidate anymore. She can't be a candidate.
She's appealing.
Yeah, but we don't see that happening. And she's under the influence of what is happening globally. There is a global far-right. Political communication is not happening in one country anymore. It's globalized. You have to get that. And Bardella, a younger one, Bardella is, maybe the next candidate. And he's very different. He's much more attuned to what is happening in the States. And it has consequences. She's pushed to be that hard because she's fighting for political survival.
And is it too early or too late for there to be a credible opponent for 2027 from the mainstream parties?
Yeah, no, it's not too late because Bardella is young. It's not that he's very popular, but he's really young. And we had a young president, and people are kind of dissatisfied with this young president. And you have to understand that the voters in France, they are leaning increasingly on the right and the far right, but they are still old, and they want to preserve a kind of, a stable situation. And they may not be willing to vote for a young candidate that they don't really know anything about. And so there is a place for a mainstream candidate, absolutely.
Hinzian, people saying, what happens in the United States, could it happen here?
You mean the riots and the...
No, I mean that we have a far-right president who pushes the levers and pushes how much authority they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're very close to that option, not just in France, but in other European countries as well. And it asks a question, and going back to your question about mainstream parties, like, what credible option is there? Are we able to actually build a strong candidacy by then, like a unified candidacy that's going to be able to stand up to those options? I don't really see it in France. It's going to be a very difficult 2027 cycle for us. But going beyond that, I think this is also something that ties us back to the topic for today's debate, which is liberal democracy and the traditional political system that we've been having for a couple of hundreds of years in Europe and the West. What is the future of liberal democracy? And I think today it's fair to say that it's not going to be the same as what we've seen thus far.
Robert Weissman, the election in 2024, that issue of liberal democracy, Kamala Harris put it on the ballot. People's eyes sometimes glazed over. They instead said that they were more concerned about inflation and thought Trump would do a better job there. If you were to give advice to the French mainstream candidates for 2027, what is the issue you would tell them to run on?
Well, I can give advice maybe better for American candidates. I don't think it's the case that Americans rejected democracy in the 2024 election. I don't think it's the case that Kamala Harris centered her campaign around that at all, actually. I think when we see polling in the United States, people do care about democracy. They want a democracy that works for them. And part of what that means is they need to see a democracy that delivers responsively to what people want, not to what big corporations demand. So I think the path forward is coupling not just the defense of democracy, but a deepening democracy with a substantive agenda that's responsive to people. People in the United States ask, if 90% of the country supports lowering drug prices, which is the case, how come it doesn't happen? And they know what the answer is. The answer is big pharma has too much political power. So for them, a working democracy has to not just have the mechanism of a formal democracy, but also has to deliver and not be captured by big corporate interests. And to me, that's the path forward, a deep commitment to an expanded and deepened and more profound democracy, and a commitment to deliver an agenda that works for everyday people. And I have to think that's a message that works in France and around the world. I know it's the right message for the United States.
We're out of time, Andrew Weissman. Do you agree?
I do, and I think one advantage that you have in France is you have a history that makes you more aware of the evils of authoritarianism that, we haven't had that history in the United States. So I think you have an electorate that is more educated about those concerns.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Many thanks for being with us, Andrew Weissman. I want to thank Hin Zian, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, Robert Weissman in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.